You know what? Any Star Trek episode with an unapologetic pro-labor message and multiple blatant masturbation jokes is going to rank pretty high with me. This is a review of the classic Star Trek Deep Space Nine episode Bar Association. If you have not seen this episode and you don't want to know what happens in it, be warned. Spoilers beyond this point. So, obviously, when I decided to take the suggestion to do a batch of reviews of labor issue episodes, this was the one that absolutely demanded inclusion. It's not the only pro-labor episode of Star Trek, but it's definitely the frankest and the most emphatically and thoroughly argued. Plus, this episode about a tense and sometimes violent labor dispute is also fun, entertaining, and ultimately kinda wholesome. How can you go wrong with that? As the episode begins, business is down at Quark's bar due to the ongoing Bajoran Time of Cleansing, a month-long religious observance during which the Bajorans abstain from food and booze and gambling. It's like they invented a holiday specifically to screw with Quark. And that's certainly how Quark feels about it. And on top of that, his brother and right-hand dipshit Rom is feeling under the weather. Very under the weather. When pouring a tube of Ferengi Alka-Seltzer into his infected ear doesn't help, Rom collapses and has to be taken to the infirmary. When Rom explains to Dr. Bashir that he's been sick for a while but hasn't been able to get away from work to seek treatment, Bashir casually suggests that Rom and his fellow employees should form a union to force Quark to stop exploiting them. Rom is resistant to the idea at first. You don't understand, he tells Bashir. Ferengi workers don't want to stop the exploitation. They want to become the exploiters. But not long after that, Quark announces that because the bar's revenue is down during the time of cleansing, everyone's pay is being cut by a third. Now that union idea starts to look better to Rom. He meets with the other workers from Quark's and pitches them the idea of organizing. The other Ferengi, who account for most of the group, react with horror. To even talk about unionizing is to invite severe reprisal from the dreaded Ferengi Commerce Authority. Rom keeps pushing, reminding everyone how unfairly Quark treats them all, and appealing to his fellow Ferengi by framing the issue not in terms of justice, but in terms of money. Quark owes them money for the work they do, and as good, profit-driven Ferengi, they should be willing to do whatever is necessary to get that money. So they all agree. Rom drops by the infirmary a short while later and says to Dr. Bashir, "Okay, I formed a union. Now what?" O'Brien, who is there to finally have the head of his parasitic twin removed from the back of his neck, congratulates Rom on the union, but warns him that they'll probably have to strike in order to convince Quark to agree to their demands. O'Brien urges Rom to be strong, just like O'Brien's ancestor, Sean O'Brien, who led a group of striking Pennsylvania coal miners in the early 20th century. Rom is briefly inspired, then O'Brien looks off wistfully and shares that Sean O'Brien's funeral was the largest in all of western Pennsylvania, because they fished his body out of the river with something between 32 and 34 bullets in him a week before the strike ended. But that's not important. What's important is he died a hero. More than a hero. A Union man. The union, officially called the Guild of Restaurant and Casino Employees, presents their demands to Quark, who laughs them off and tells him to get back to work. So, they strike and walk out. Suddenly, it's not so funny to Quark. He tries to keep the bar running using holograms as waiters, but they don't work so good. He implores Odo to run off the striking workers who are picketing outside the main entrance. Odo is sympathetic to Quark's position. He views the picketing strikers as a mob and a threat to order. But Odo refuses to help Quark break the strike because Captain Sisko supports the Union. As long as the strikers remain peaceful and allow customers to enter Quark's through the upstairs entrance, Odo's staying out of it. The strikers do remain peaceful. Some of those watching the strike, not so much. O'Brien and Bashir are hanging out across from that upstairs entrance to Quark's, observing people as they approach, guessing whether they will respect the strike and pass by or cross the picket line and enter. I love the not-so-subtle character selections in this scene. The intelligent and ethical Vulcan passes by and supports the strike, while the oblivious shit-for-brains Pakleds walk right on in. One of the people walking by is Worf, who O'Brien is certain will pass by. But Worf enters. He chooses to patronize the Struck establishment. And, as we recently learned, that one moment was a great inspiration to the guy who played Chakotay. O'Brien chases after Worf to talk some sense into him. Bashir follows. And we cut to all three of them locked up in security because apparently there was a bit of a brawl. Words were exchanged. There was a bit of shoving. Bashir got thrown over a table. Such is life. However, the sight of three of his senior officers in the brig does persuade Captain Sisko that it's time for him to get involved. So he calls Quark to his office and says, "Settle the strike." Quark says, "I'd love to settle the strike." Sisko says, "Great, talk to your brother. Negotiate an agreement. Settle the strike." Quark says, "Well, the thing is, negotiating with strikers goes against thousands of years of Ferengi tradition, so you see, it's not that simple." Sisko says, "Then I'll make it simple for you. This space station is administrated by the Federation. We don't charge you rent, we don't charge you for maintenance, and we don't charge you for the power you use. I bet if I added up the value of all that free stuff we've given you over the last few years, that would come to a lot of money, wouldn't it?" Uh-huh. Settle the strike. Quark attempts to settle the strike the Ferengi way by offering Rom a bribe, which Rom refuses. By now, the strike has dragged on long enough that, as some of the Ferengi feared, the Ferengi Commerce Authority, the FCA, has taken notice. Liquidator Brunt arrives on the station, declares to Quark that he has been authorized to break the strike by any means necessary, and barges in on a union meeting with his big scary henchmen to threaten Rom and the others, telling them if they aren't back to work in the morning, their accounts back home on Ferenginar will be wiped out, their families will be fined, and they'll be financially ruined. But it doesn't work. Partially because Rom is a strong and inspiring leader, and partially because Rom reminds his fellow Ferengi that if their accounts back home on Ferenginar were worth anything, they wouldn't be here waiting tables at a bar on a shithole space station. Quark makes one last attempt to convince Rom to end the strike, but Rom refuses. So Brunt decides it's time for drastic action. He won't attack Rom directly. That would only make him a martyr and strengthen the strikers' resolve. Instead, he has his goons rough up Quark. But even the sight of his own brother bruised and battered in the infirmary doesn't move Rom to end the strike. In fact, he's kind of tickled to see Quark like this, and no wonder. Not only was it Quark being a crummy boss that started all this, it was just a few years ago that Rom almost blasted Quark out of an airlock. He's usually a nice guy, but don't fuck with Rom. There's murder inside him. Finally, Quark relents. He agrees to meet all of Rom's demands, even higher wages, though he does try to weasel out of that one at first. But there's a catch. Rom must dissolve the union. That way, the FCA will think Quark won the labor dispute and broke the strike, and the workers will get everything they asked for. Rom agrees to the compromise, and with the Bajoran time of cleansing coming to an end, Quark's bar is back in business, and business is good. That doesn't mean everything's back to the way it was before the strike, though. Not only do Quark's waiters and Dabo girls get raises and improved benefits, Rom decides it's time for a change, quits his job at Quark's, and joins the station's Bajoran maintenance crew. The strikers have won, and through Rom we see that they've won something even more important than money. They've won independence and pride. It probably won't surprise you when I say that I think this is a great episode, one of my favorite Deep Space Nine episodes. What makes it so great is that, as I mentioned earlier, it works equally well as a story and as a delivery system for its message. Let me start with the message because that's the reason I'm reviewing this episode now. This is one of the most openly, proudly, unapologetically pro-labor episodes of television I've ever seen. It's not just that the episode takes a stand and stands on the right side, it's how thoroughly and effectively the episode dramatizes a labor dispute, what causes it, what the costs of it are, and how it should be resolved. When Dr. Bashir first suggests the possibility of forming a union, Rom rejects it because Ferengi workers don't want to stop the exploitation, they want to become the exploiters. And that reminds me of the famous John Steinbeck quote about how socialism never caught on in America because in America we don't have an exploited working class, just a bunch of temporarily embarrassed millionaires. But what changes Rom's mind? What changes the minds of the other workers? Realizing that they don't need to become the bosses, the exploiters, in order to profit. If they band together, they can force Quark to compensate them fairly, or more fairly anyway, for their labor. I also appreciate the way the episode depicts the forces that oppose the Union. Quark himself is not the enemy. The system that rewards his exploitation of his workers while condemning the workers to always be exploited is the enemy. It's obvious that Quark can afford to meet every demand made by the workers. It's obvious he doesn't need to cut their pay to survive for the month of slow business brought on by the Bajoran time of cleansing. Quark behaves the way he does because he's allowed to. And his values are shaped by a tradition that celebrates that sort of behavior. When he's challenged by the Union and by Captain Sisko, Quark falls back on an appeal to that same tradition, to that same system. Eventually, the system itself, represented by Brunt and his goons, strikes back violently. Brunt threatens the strikers, tells them if they were back on the Ferengi homeworld, they would all be killed. Tells them if they don't get back to work, they and their families will be ruined. When that fails, he attacks Quark, the boss being struck against, because Brunt knows that Rom cares about Quark, and Brunt isn't here to help Quark get his business back open. Brunt is here to make sure everyone remains in their proper place, and that the established way of doing things is not altered or interrupted. The episode also does an excellent job portraying those with more indirect involvement in the strike. For example, Odo, representing the cops. He's hostile to the strike because it violates his sense of order. He doesn't care about workers' rights, he just wants everyone to follow the rules. But Odo doesn't break the strike. Why? Because Sisko, commander of the station, tells him not to. Sisko takes the role of the government, the ultimate authority, and here the episode takes on an aspirational quality, but hopefully also an instructive one. Sisko, the government, supports the strike. He orders that the rights of the strikers be upheld. Historically, governments have not always taken this position, but the episode shows us how important and powerful it is when government does support the strikers. Imagine how much less bloody the history of the labor movement would be if the government, operated by elected officials, theoretically tasked with carrying out the will of the people and protecting the rights and interests of the people, actually sided with the people, with the strikers, demanding fair treatment, instead of with the companies. Pay attention also to who Sisko goes to when he decides it's time to end the strike. He doesn't meet with Rom. He doesn't tell the union, stop all this nonsense about higher wages and paid sick leave and get back to work. He tells Quark, meet with Rom and come to an agreement, because Sisko knows, as the creators of this episode know, as we should know, that strikes are not the fault of the union, and settling strikes is not the responsibility of the union. Strikes result from unfair treatment by the bosses, and it's the bosses who need to settle them by offering a fair deal to the workers. And what does Sisko use to pressure Quark to go back to the table with the union? He brings up all the ways that Quark has benefited from what are essentially government subsidies. Free rent, free electricity, free maintenance, benefits which Quark has profited from while not sharing those profits with his employees. Quark cries poverty when facing his workers while hoarding his money and mooching off the government the entire time. It's wonderful. The analogy, I mean, not what Quark does. Though, from his perspective, I guess it was pretty wonderful too. While it lasted. Turning to other aspects of the episode, I love the way it presents this extremely thoughtful and stirringly righteous argument for workers' rights with a tone that sometimes borders on the cartoonish. Ironically enough, things really start to get silly once the heavy shows up, the heavy being Brunt, brought to life by a typical, delightfully hammy Jeffrey Combs performance. Brunt is only in a few scenes, but Combs really makes a meal out of them, chewing all the scenery in sight, playing Brunt like a mobster from a Looney Tunes short, which isn't that far off, really. As good as Combs is as Brunt, though, the episode lives or dies by the performance of Max Grodenchik as Rom, and Grodenchik is more than up to the challenge. He leans into the goofier, more pathetic side of Rom early on, giving us the brilliant sight gag of Rom pouring medicine into his ear, plus that hilariously humiliating admission to Lita that maybe the reason his ears have hurt so much lately is that he can't keep his hands off of them, which is the Ferengi equivalent of telling a girl you've been jerking off so much you hurt yourself. But then Grodenchik takes Rom's clownishness and his innocence and transforms it into resolve by way of desperation. He's had all he can stands, and he can't stands no more. Inspired by the heroic but grim example of Sean O'Brien, Rom goes from cowed underling to Marx-quoting union leader within a matter of days, and thanks to Grodenchik's performance and the aforementioned exaggerated and somewhat comical tone, I totally buy it. There's a subplot I haven't mentioned about Worf hating life aboard Deep Space Nine so much that he decides to move to the Defiant full-time. It's interesting for a couple of reasons. We see the simmering romance between Worf and Dax continue to progress. We see Worf struggling to fit in on Deep Space Nine, which is such a smart choice for the writers to make, because from the moment he joined the show, all of us watching were wondering how Worf was going to fit in on Deep Space Nine, and it wasn't always encouraging. The producers didn't ask for Worf. The studio gave them Worf because they hoped his presence would boost the ratings, and it took a little while for them to figure out what to do with Worf, who he was going to be on this show. This episode is a solid step in that direction. Worf's subplot also serves the labor-related main plot, though, albeit in a very subtle way. It would seem to have nothing to do with the strike story other than Worf and O'Brien's fight, that is, but think about it. Worf's story is all about him trying to figure out what he needs to be comfortable and happy. He figures it out, and he's able to get what he needs. Before their fight, he has another scene with O'Brien, where Worf complains about how nothing works on the station, and O'Brien thinks that's great, because it's O'Brien's job to fix things. "This place needs me," O'Brien says. Unlike Rom and the Strikers, Worf and O'Brien are from the world of the Federation, where money doesn't exist, where people don't have to trade their labor for the essentials of life. They don't work to eat or keep a roof over their heads or clothes on their backs. They work because they want to, and they have the freedom to choose work that means something to them and to do that work and live their lives in ways they find comfortable. They have what Rom and the Strikers are asking for, and it's really not that much, but it's also kind of everything. Those are my thoughts on Bar Association. What do you think of this episode? Please share your thoughts with me in the comments. If you'd like to support this channel, and I sure wish you would, if you can afford it, you can do so by becoming a patron at patreon.com/Steve Shives, becoming a channel member by clicking the join button, or by making a one-time gift by clicking the thanks button, or via PayPal or Venmo. Links are in the description. For the past 2 months, this has been where I encourage you to watch for Jason and I to review the new episode of Strange New Worlds this weekend, but there ain't no new episode of Strange New Worlds because all 10 episodes have been released. So, no Strange New Worlds review this weekend, but our reviews of Season 2 are up on the channel for your enjoyment. If you haven't seen them, I'll link to the full playlist in the description, and Please come back next week for another retro review. This batch of labor-themed reviews has 2 more episodes to go, and they are both Star Trek Voyager episodes. Next week, it's a review of a 2-parter entitled Workforce. I'll see you next week for that. Thanks for watching, and take care, everybody.